The roar of motorcycles thundered through the dark, quiet streets of an old neighborhood. A gang of bikers, dressed in leather vests marked with skull patches, circled a dimly lit alley. They were laughing, drinking beer, and taunting the man lying on the cold pavement. His clothes were ragged, his face dirtied by weeks without a proper wash. They didn't know who he was, but that didn't stop them from making cruel remarks. "Get up, dirtbag," one of them sneered, nudging the man with the toe of his boot. The man, his eyes bloodshot and tired, didn't move. He had learned long ago to avoid confrontation, especially with people who had nothing to lose. But today, something was different. He felt a strange chill in the air. "Thought you'd stay hidden in the shadows, huh? You too good for us?" Another biker jeered, stepping forward with a smirk. The man's chest tightened. His mind raced. He couldn't give in now. Not after everything he had been through. "You really want to keep messing with me?" The man's voice was low but firm. A sudden silence fell over the bikers. They hadn't expected him to speak, let alone speak back. Their leader, a bulky man with a thick beard named Johnny, narrowed his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Johnny growled, leaning down to get closer to the man's face. The homeless man, whose name was Marcus, let out a slow breath. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. Johnny smirked, assuming he was about to pull out a knife or some other weapon. Instead, Marcus revealed a small silver badge. The bikers froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Johnny blinked, clearly confused. "What the hell?" He muttered under his breath. "FBI?" Marcus said, flashing the badge again, this time with authority in his voice. "You just picked the wrong guy to mess with." Johnny's face turned pale, his tough guy demeanor slipping away. The rest of the bikers were stunned, some of them taking a nervous step back. The laughter and mockery vanished as fast as it had come. You're one of them?" Johnny stammered. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, brushing off the dirt from his jacket, his movements calm but purposeful. His eyes met Johnny's, and it was as if the world shifted. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. It felt like time had stopped, and the danger hung in the air, thick and suffocating. But then, as if breaking the silence, one of the bikers, a younger man with a rough-looking face, pulled out a gun. The scene exploded into chaos. "Shoot him!" The biker yelled, pointing the gun at Marcus, his hand shaking slightly. Without hesitation, Marcus lunged forward, knocking the gun out of the young man's hand before he could pull the trigger. It fell to the ground with a loud clatter, and the bikers immediately took a step back, suddenly realizing they were no longer in control. Marcus' heart pounded in his chest. He had to think fast. He couldn't let them get away with this, but more than that, he needed to survive. The bikers were dangerous, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his cool. Johnny, now looking more frantic, stepped forward. "You don't know who we are," he warned, his voice no longer sounding so sure of himself. "We don't just mess with anyone." "I don't care who you are," Marcus said, his voice steady as he backed away slowly, keeping his eyes locked on Johnny. "You're making a huge mistake." Just as Marcus took another step backward, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. Johnny and the others turned, momentarily distracted by the noise. It was enough time for Marcus to grab the gun from the ground and point it toward the bikers, his finger hovering over the trigger. Everything seemed to slow down. But just as he was about to make a move, a loud crack rang through the alley. Marcus felt a sharp pain explode in his side. Everything went black. It was a small office building near downtown, a different world altogether. Marcus had been sent here on assignment, a mission he could barely explain, even to his own superiors. It wasn't just about gathering intel. It was about blending in, getting close, and playing a dangerous game. The FBI had been investigating the biker gang, and they had no idea they were about to meet their worst enemy yet. Marcus had been homeless for months. It was part of his cover. The gang was involved in all sorts of shady activities, but they were known for their racism, their hatred for anyone who didn't look like them. Marcus, being a black man, was the perfect person to slip under their radar. He had watched them for weeks, moving with careful precision. Everything was going according to plan. He had learned their routines, their hangouts, their weaknesses. But now tonight, everything was different. The bikers had cornered him in the alley, and now after the gunshot, he was lying on the cold concrete, his breath shallow and his vision blurry. Every part of him wanted to give up, but he couldn't. Not now. His mind raced, trying to remember the protocol, the steps he needed to take in this situation. He had to make it out alive. He had to finish the mission. He felt a presence near him. The cold steel of the gun, the echo of the sirens, the distant rumble of motorcycles. They were coming for him, and there was no way to stop them. But what happened next? Would the bikers be his undoing? Or could Marcus fight back and turn the tables on them? It had all started years ago when Marcus first joined the FBI. A deep sense of justice had driven him to serve his country, and despite the challenges he faced in a world that often didn't understand him, he had always pushed forward. The day he received his assignment to infiltrate the gang had been both a reward and a curse. This mission was more dangerous than anything he had faced before. He had spent weeks in their company, pretending to be just another homeless man they could abuse and look down on. But deep inside, Marcus was never really one of them. He didn't belong in their world of hate and violence. And now, lying on the cold pavement, he was wondering how much longer he could keep up the act. The bikers had no idea that the man they were tormenting was actually working for the FBI. They had no idea that everything they had done had been watched and recorded. But Marcus had no choice but to act as if he didn't know who they were. He felt the blood trickling from his side, a reminder that the danger was far from over. The bikers were closing in, and Marcus could hear their mocking laughter in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Would Marcus survive the attack, or was this the end of his mission? The answers were about to unfold. The pain in Marcus's side was unbearable. His body was numb, and for a moment, he wasn't sure whether he was dreaming or awake. His hand trembled as he tried to grip the gun that had fallen to the pavement beside him, but the effort was sluggish. Blood seeped from the wound, soaking into his jacket and staining his fingers. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The bikers were too close. Johnny had regained his composure and was barking orders at the rest of his gang. "Move in. Get him," he shouted, his voice sharp with panic. It was obvious now. They weren't just going to let Marcus walk away. Marcus could hear the sound of boots shuffling closer, the rough whispers of the gangsters talking amongst themselves. The sirens were still distant but growing louder, but the bikers were too desperate to be intimidated. They were in full-on attack mode, and it felt like Marcus was trapped in the middle of a nightmare he couldn't escape. He could see Johnny's silhouette now, looming over him like a dark shadow. "You really thought you could fool us?" Johnny sneered, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, searching for any sign of weakness. The bikers were closing in, and the alley felt narrower with every passing second. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been trained for situations like this. He knew how to keep a cool head. He was a special agent of the FBI, after all, and there was no room for panic now. The mission was too important. Using his elbow, Marcus propped himself up slightly, then reached for the gun once more. His fingers brushed it, and with a grunt of effort, he seized it tightly, bringing it up to point directly at Johnny. Johnny stopped in his tracks. The other bikers paused as well, unsure of what to do. For a second, it felt like everyone was holding their breath. "I'm not afraid of you," Marcus said, his voice low but full of authority. Johnny stared at him, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "You don't scare me, cop," he growled, inching forward again, thinking he could overpower the injured man. "You're just a dead man walking." That was when Marcus did something unexpected. With a swift motion, he fired a warning shot into the air. The loud bang echoed through the alley, startling the bikers. "Stay back," Marcus said firmly, his fingers still steady on the trigger. The pain in his side was excruciating, but he couldn't afford to lose control. The bikers weren't backing down yet. Johnny's eyes narrowed. "You've got balls, I'll give you that," he spat, taking another step forward. "But you're outnumbered. You're already hurt. What are you gonna do now?" Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't let them take him down. He needed to stay in control, or this would all end very badly. The sirens were getting closer, but not close enough. He had to act fast. In a desperate move, he lunged toward Johnny, shoving the gun toward his chest. Johnny staggered backward, surprised by the sudden aggression, but he was still bigger, faster, and stronger. He swung his fist at Marcus, catching him across the jaw. The force of the blow knocked Marcus back, sending him crashing into a nearby dumpster. Pain shot through Marcus's skull, but he managed to stay conscious. Blood dripped down his chin, and his vision blurred momentarily, but he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Through the haze of pain, he saw Johnny approaching again, his hand reaching for a knife at his belt. It gleamed under the faint light from the street lamps. The bikers were closing in, 4 of them, all armed and ready to make their move. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about taking them down. He had to stop the gang. He had to finish what he'd started. Just as Johnny raised the knife, a loud voice suddenly cut through the air. "FBI, drop your weapons." The bikers froze, and Marcus couldn't believe his ears. He turned his head and saw a team of uniformed FBI agents bursting into the alley, weapons drawn, surrounding the gang from every direction. Johnny's eyes went wide. "What the hell?" He shouted, his knife still poised in the air. The gang members started to retreat, but the agents had already closed in, and within seconds, they were all on the ground, handcuffed and struggling against the weight of the law. Marcus's breath came in ragged gasps as the agents rushed to his side. One of them, a tall woman with short, dark hair, knelt beside him and immediately began applying pressure to his wound. "You're okay," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Hang in there, Marcus. We've got you." For a moment, everything seemed to blur together. The bikers were yelling, some of them still trying to resist. But the agents were quick to handle the situation. One by one, they were hauled away in handcuffs, cursing and screaming as they were led to the police vehicles waiting outside. Marcus, too weak to speak, felt himself being lifted and carried toward the ambulance. The woman agent stayed by his side, her eyes scanning his face with concern. "Take it easy," she told him. "We've got this." Marcus wanted to speak, to ask her what had happened, how they had found him. But his vision was starting to fade again. The pain in his side was growing duller now, and he felt the world slip away. But before he passed out, one question echoed in his mind. Who had tipped off the FBI? The days that followed were a blur for Marcus. He was rushed to the hospital, and his wound was treated. The doctors said he was lucky to be alive, but luck wasn't what had kept him breathing. It was his training, his instincts, and a little bit of help from his colleagues. As he slowly recovered, he couldn't help but think about the bikers, about Johnny and the rest of them. They were dangerous, and they weren't going to stay quiet for long. Even though they had been arrested, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. But the most troubling thought of all, there was someone inside the FBI who had known exactly where he was, exactly when he needed backup. Someone had given the order to save him. But who? And why? The next morning, Marcus was sitting in a small, dimly lit room in the FBI office. He had just finished reading the report on the biker gang's arrest, but something about it didn't sit right with him. The arrest had been too clean, too easy. He had expected a lot more resistance, and yet the gang had folded like a house of cards the moment the agents arrived. Something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this mission than he had been told. That perhaps someone had been playing a much deeper game, and Marcus had just been a pawn in it. His phone buzzed. He picked it up, and his eyes widened as he read the text. "You need to be careful. You're being watched." Who had sent it? The message sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He stared at the screen, his heart racing, but the words didn't give him much to go on. You're being watched. Who would send something like that? Who would want him to be careful? The first thought that crossed his mind was that it was someone from the biker gang, one of the ones who had slipped through the cracks. But that didn't make sense. The FBI had moved fast to capture all of them. There shouldn't have been anyone left who could be a threat. He stared at the phone, his thumb hovering over the reply button. Who could he trust now? The mission had already spiraled into chaos, and the bikers were just a small piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, a knock at the door broke his concentration. He quickly slipped the phone into his pocket, forcing a calm expression on his face. "Come in," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The door creaked open, and a woman in a dark blue FBI jacket stepped inside. She had short black hair and sharp, calculating eyes. Marcus recognized her instantly. Agent Rebecca Lawson. She had been part of the team that had rescued him from the alley. She was also his handler on the case. "Marcus," she said with a polite nod as she closed the door behind her. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied, trying to mask the tension in his voice. "What's going on?" Rebecca studied him for a moment, her gaze flicking to the phone in his hand. "You look like you've got something on your mind," she said, her voice smooth, but with a hint of concern. Marcus didn't want to look paranoid, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "I got a text," he said quietly, watching her closely. It said, "You're being watched." Rebecca didn't react immediately. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, her expression neutral. "From who?" "I don't know," Marcus replied. "It just came through on my phone. Could be some kind of prank, but—" "You think it's related to the mission?" she interrupted, her voice lowering. "I'm not sure," Marcus admitted. He was trying to make sense of it all, but it was difficult. Everything seemed to be happening so fast. The bikers had been arrested, but there was still something lingering in the air, a sense of unfinished business. Rebecca took a step closer, her eyes scanning his face as if she was trying to read his thoughts. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if you think someone's compromising your safety, we'll investigate. But we need to be careful. The case is far from over." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. There was something in her eyes, a hint of uncertainty, maybe even guilt. He had worked with her before, and Rebecca wasn't one to show weakness, but today she seemed different. He opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could, a voice came through the door. "Agent Lawson?" It was a man's voice, deep, authoritative. Rebecca sighed and turned toward the door. "Come in, Agent Davis." The door opened wider, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped into the room. He had short, graying hair and a sharp jawline, his posture rigid and confident. Marcus didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made it clear he wasn't someone to cross. Agent Davis didn't bother with pleasantries. He looked straight at Marcus. "We need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with authority. Marcus frowned, wondering what this was about. About what? Davis walked to the desk and placed a folder on it. The man's eyes flicked toward Rebecca for a brief moment before he looked back at Marcus. "We've received some troubling intel," Davis said. "About you." Marcus felt a cold rush of anxiety surge through him. His mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. "Troubling intel?" Rebecca glanced at Marcus, then at Davis before speaking. "What kind of intel?" Davis ignored her question and addressed Marcus directly. "We've learned that someone within the FBI has been leaking information about your cover. We don't know who, but we have a suspicion. It's possible that the gang's arrest was tipped off by someone on the inside." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "So you're saying—" "That someone within this agency has been working with the bikers," Davis interrupted. "And we believe that they may have been monitoring your movements." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Are you saying we've been compromised?" Davis's eyes narrowed. "Yes. The leaks are coming from higher up. We're still piecing everything together, but you need to be extra careful now. If you think someone is watching you, trust your instincts." Marcus didn't know how to respond. His mind was spinning. He had always trusted the FBI, but this was different. Someone he worked with, someone on the inside, had betrayed him. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the surge of panic he was fighting. Davis's eyes remained cold. For now, we put a pause on your mission. We need to figure out who's behind the leaks before it gets worse. If you're compromised, we don't want you anywhere near the gang until we can sort this out. Marcus didn't like the idea of stepping back, but he knew there was no way around it. He was already too deep into the investigation to back out now, but it seemed like he was being forced to take a different approach. Rebecca spoke up. We'll need to do a full sweep of the department, check communications and make sure no one else is in danger. Marcus nodded. I get it. But if someone's tipping off the bikers, then they're going to make another move soon. Davis's face darkened. That's what we're hoping to prevent. But we'll need your help, Marcus. Stay alert. Trust no one. The room was silent for a long moment as the gravity of the situation sank in. Marcus had always believed in the mission, in the work of the FBI. But now, it seemed that someone close to him, was using that trust against him. As Davis turned to leave, Marcus felt the weight of his words settle in. The betrayal he had suspected, the cracks in the foundation of the FBI, everything was starting to come to light. Marcus was no longer just a pawn in a game, he was now a target. As Davis walked out, Rebecca hesitated before following him. She gave Marcus a quick, searching look, as if weighing something in her mind. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Marcus could almost hear the unspoken words between them. She knew something he didn't. He couldn't let it go. Rebecca, Marcus called before she could leave. She paused in the doorway, glancing back at him. Who do you think is behind this? He asked quietly, his voice laced with suspicion. Rebecca hesitated for just a second too long. We'll find out, she said softly. We always do. But as she left, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of her words and the truth that she might know more than she was letting on. The question lingered in his mind. Who could he trust now? Marcus sat in the empty office, his mind racing. The FBI had always been his family, his team. He had spent years training, working with people he thought he could rely on. But now, everything felt different. The betrayal, the leaks. It all felt like a weight he couldn't escape. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to make sense of it, but the more he thought about it, the less clear it became. Who could be working against him? He had to find answers. Fast. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this slide. The bikers were still out there, and whoever was working with them had to be stopped. Marcus glanced at the clock. It was late, well past midnight. Most of the building was quiet now, but he wasn't about to sleep. Not when things were this uncertain. His phone buzzed again, a message lighting up the screen. Meet me at the warehouse. Midnight. You're not safe. I know what's happening. The message was from an unknown number. The warning sent a chill through Marcus's chest. He thought about the text he'd received earlier, the one that told him he was being watched. Was this connected? Who was behind this? Without wasting any more time, Marcus grabbed his jacket and left the office, moving quickly through the darkened hallways. He knew he couldn't trust anyone at the FBI right now. He had to go alone. The warehouse was a place he'd been to before, an old shipping facility on the edge of town, hidden behind rusted metal fences and dark corners. He had no idea who might be waiting for him, but there was no turning back now. The night air was cool as Marcus stepped outside, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. The city was still alive, its hum distant but constant. His eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of danger. But there was nothing. Not yet. He got into his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped toward the warehouse. The drive felt longer than usual, his mind caught between the thoughts of who had sent the message and what they might want from him. Could it be an ally from the inside? Or someone trying to take him out before he uncovered too much? When he arrived at the warehouse, it was just as he remembered, silent and dark. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind pushing through the broken windows. Marcus parked his car far enough away to stay out of sight, but close enough to make a quick getaway if he needed to. He pulled the collar of his jacket up to shield his face from the chill, then approached the entrance. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit interior. The place smelled of old wood, dust, and the faintest hint of oil. "Anyone here?" Marcus called into the silence, his voice low. There was no answer at first, and he didn't move. His hand rested on the gun at his side, ready to draw it if necessary. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he couldn't let his guard down. Then a shadow moved in the distance. Marcus. The voice came from the far corner, barely audible, but enough to send a shiver down his spine. Marcus's eyes immediately locked onto the figure emerging from the shadows. It was Rebecca. His heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting someone else, maybe an informant or a stranger. But this didn't make sense. Why would Rebecca be here alone in the middle of the night? Especially after the tension between them earlier. "Rebecca," Marcus said, his voice cold and cautious. "What the hell is going on? Who's behind this?" Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't want to involve you, but there's no other way. You're in danger, Marcus." He took a step closer, his suspicion growing. "Danger? You're the one who put me in this mess. You knew something was wrong with the investigation, didn't you? You know who's behind it. Just tell me. I'm done with the games." Rebecca's eyes flickered to the side, then back to him. "I didn't want you to get caught up in this. I'm not the one you should be worried about. It's Director Davis." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. "Davis?" he repeated, barely able to comprehend what she was saying. "The director?" Rebecca nodded, her face etched with worry. "Yes, he's the one behind the leaks. He's been orchestrating the entire operation, feeding the bikers information, making sure they stay one step ahead of us. He's the one who tipped them off about the raid, and he's the reason they knew where you were tonight." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. The director. Davis had been the one who told him to be careful, the one who ordered him to trust no one, and now Rebecca was saying he was the mastermind behind everything. But why? Why would Davis do this? Why would he do that? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's his angle?" Rebecca took a deep breath, her gaze locked on the floor. "Money. Power. The gang has ties to some of the highest bidders in the city, politicians, businessmen. They've been laundering money through various channels, and Davis is in on it. He's been using the bikers to cover his tracks, to erase anyone who gets too close to the truth." Marcus's mind raced. If what Rebecca was saying was true, then this wasn't just about a gang of bikers anymore. This was much bigger. A web of corruption that stretched through the very heart of the FBI. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper now. "I'm not supposed to be telling you this, Marcus, but I can't let you get caught in the crossfire. You have to trust me." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear, anger, and betrayal swirling inside him. "How do I know I can trust you? You've been working with Davis this whole time." "I haven't been working with him," Rebecca snapped, her voice sharper than he expected. "I've been investigating him. I've known for a while, but I didn't have enough proof to go public. Not until now." Marcus felt a slight shift in his thoughts, but the doubt was still there. "So what now? What do we do?" Rebecca took a step back, her face serious. "We take him down. Together. I know what he's doing, and I have enough evidence to put him away. But I need you to help me. We can't do this alone. The agency is compromised, and we're running out of time." Marcus hesitated. Every instinct in him told him to be careful, to walk away. But deep down he knew there was no going back. The mission had changed. It was no longer just about infiltrating a biker gang. It was about stopping the corruption inside the FBI itself. "All right," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Let's do it. But we do this on my terms." Rebecca nodded, a slight relief passing over her face. "Agreed. We'll work together. and we'll make sure Davis doesn't get away with this." Before Marcus could respond, there was a sudden noise. A door slamming open in the distance. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the warehouse. "Damn it," Marcus muttered under his breath. "We're not alone." Rebecca's eyes widened. "It's too late. We've been compromised." Marcus turned quickly, his hand already on his weapon, as the footsteps grew louder. Who was behind them? The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the cavernous warehouse. Marcus's senses went on high alert, every muscle tensed. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the sound of boots hitting the concrete floor grew nearer. He instinctively grabbed Rebecca's arm, pulling her behind a stack of wooden crates near the back wall. His gun was out, hidden at his side, ready to be drawn in an instant. "What the hell's going on?" Rebecca whispered urgently, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," Marcus replied in a low voice, "but we need to move. Now." They crouched low, moving silently behind the crates, but the sound of boots continued to grow louder, as if it were closing in on them. Suddenly there was a shout, loud, gruff, and unmistakable. "Where the hell are they?" Marcus's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. It was Davis. Rebecca's eyes widened in panic. "He's here," she breathed. "He's got a team with him." Marcus didn't have time to think. He grabbed Rebecca by the wrist and pulled her toward the back exit of the warehouse, careful to stay out of sight. Every step felt like a drumbeat in his ears, and his mind raced with the realization that the director had been onto them all along. They were being cornered. They reached the back door, only to find it locked. Marcus cursed under his breath. "Any other way out?" he whispered urgently. Rebecca's mind raced. "There's a maintenance tunnel behind the old freezer unit. We can get through there, but we'll have to move fast." "Lead the way," Marcus said. They moved quickly, their footsteps silent on the dusty floor as they made their way toward the old freezer unit. Rebecca knew the layout of the warehouse well, but time was running out. The sound of Davis and his team was growing closer, their voices cutting through the air with increasing urgency. Marcus could hear Davis barking orders, telling his team to split up, to search the entire building. They reached the freezer unit, and with a quick motion, Rebecca yanked open a rusted metal door to reveal a narrow, dimly lit corridor. She shoved Marcus inside, following him in just as the sound of approaching footsteps reached their ears. The tunnel was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew. It was barely wide enough for them to move side by side, and the low ceiling made it feel like they were walking through a cave. Marcus's mind raced as they moved through the dark passage, but all he could think about was how close they had come to being caught. Davis had been waiting for them. He knew everything. Rebecca didn't speak as they moved, her expression grim as they pushed forward. The sound of the warehouse had faded, but Marcus could hear faint murmurs from behind them, faint but unmistakable, the sound of Davis's men moving through the building, still searching for them. "How did he know we were here?" Marcus asked, his voice low but filled with suspicion. Rebecca shook her head, her eyes flicking to the shadows ahead. "I don't know. He must have had someone following us. I thought we had more time." The tunnel twisted and turned, but finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached another door. Rebecca pulled it open, revealing a small, dimly lit alley behind the warehouse. They had made it out. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marcus took a deep breath, his hand still clenched around his gun, his heart hammering in his chest. They were out, but not safe yet. Davis wasn't going to let them go that easily. "I need to know everything, Rebecca," Marcus said, his voice low but intense. "You've been working against him all this time. What's your play? Why now?" Rebecca's eyes flashed, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked over her shoulder, her gaze darting to the alley entrance, as though expecting someone to be there. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with frustration. "I've been working on gathering evidence for months," she said, her tone sharp. "I knew something wasn't right with Davis. He was always too involved in the biker case, pushing us to make fast decisions. Too many things didn't add up." The first time I realized something was off was when we found the connection between the gang and several high-ranking politicians. Davis was part of the chain, one of the links that kept them hidden. "Then why didn't you come forward sooner?" Marcus asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "You could have blown this whole thing wide open." Rebecca's face darkened and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I wasn't sure who to trust. Davis has too many people in his pocket. If I'd gone public too soon, he would have buried me, and I'd never get the proof we needed to take him down." Marcus's mind raced as he processed what she said. If Davis had been involved with the bikers from the start, that meant he had been working both sides of the law for years, making sure the gang had protection, laundering money, and taking down anyone who threatened his empire. The deeper Marcus thought about it, the more he realized just how much power Davis had, and the more dangerous it would be to try and bring him down. "So what's next?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the alley again, still on edge. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice low. "We go after him. I've got enough evidence to make a case, but I need you to back me up. We need to catch him before he can destroy everything we've got." "Sounds like a suicide mission," Marcus muttered, but deep down he knew there was no turning back. He had already risked everything by getting involved, and the stakes were higher than ever now. If they didn't stop Davis, more people would get hurt, maybe even killed. He glanced back toward the warehouse, where the faint sound of shouting could be heard. Davis was likely organizing a manhunt, and Marcus knew they had only minutes before the entire area was swarming with agents loyal to him. "We need to move now," Marcus said, pulling Rebecca along with him. "We've got one shot at this." They'd sprinted down the alley, moving fast but staying low, trying to keep out of sight. Marcus kept his gun ready, scanning every corner. His thoughts were clear now. They had to find Davis and take him down before he disappeared for good. But deep down, a cold knot formed in Marcus's stomach. There was a chance that Davis had already thought of everything. There was a chance that they were walking straight into a trap. The alley behind the warehouse was eerily quiet as Marcus and Rebecca made their way into the shadows. The faint sound of distant sirens and the occasional murmur of voices from the streets were the only sounds that kept the tension palpable. Marcus kept his gun close, eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Every step felt like a countdown, a race against time. Davis's men could be anywhere, closing in on their position. "Which way?" Marcus asked, his voice a tight whisper. Rebecca glanced around, her expression hardened with determination. She was thinking fast, but the pressure was starting to show. "We need to get to my car. It's parked a few blocks away, on the other side of that intersection." She pointed ahead, where a narrow street led into a busier part of the city. Marcus nodded, the plan simple but risky. They couldn't afford to get cornered, but the further they stayed in the open, the more likely Davis's people would catch up to them. "Let's move," he said, and they darted out from the alley into the street, keeping to the edges and staying low. The street was still bustling with late-night activity, but there was something about the air that felt off. People were going about their business, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone somewhere was watching. They reached the intersection without incident, but Marcus's nerves were on edge. He kept looking over his shoulder, feeling the weight of eyes on him, even though he didn't know where the threat was coming from. The entire city felt like a trap now. Rebecca led them to a narrow parking lot tucked behind a corner store, her eyes scanning the area. Then her pace slowed as she reached a silver sedan parked against the far wall. "That's it," she said as they approached the car. "We can lay low for a while, figure out our next move." Marcus didn't reply. He was already scanning the shadows around them, feeling the creeping sense that something wasn't right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something too quiet, too controlled. Rebecca unlocked the car and they both slid inside. She started the engine, but Marcus could tell her mind was racing. She was calculating their next move, weighing their options. "How much evidence do you have on Davis?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now that they were momentarily out of immediate danger. Rebecca kept her eyes on the road as she accelerated, the city lights flickering by in the rearview mirror. I have records. Emails, bank transactions, some footage. It's not everything we need, but it's enough to prove he's been colluding with the bikers and with several politicians. But I still need more. A final piece of the puzzle. Where do we get that? Marcus asked, his fingers tapping the grip of his gun, as though it was the only thing holding the world together right now. Rebecca's jaw tightened. The FBI database. It's where Davis keeps the more sensitive information. The stuff no one's supposed to see. It's all encrypted, but I found a way to get in. I just need a few hours. Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprise creeping into his voice. You've hacked into the FBI database? Rebecca didn't answer immediately, but her eyes flicked to him briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't hack it. I have a way in through a back door. But we need to get to the server room in the building. It's locked down, but I've been tracking the system's security updates. It's possible to get in, but only if we're careful. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics, and Davis won't know what hit him. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. If we're fast enough, he won't have time to cover his tracks. We just need to stay ahead of him. The problem is that he's probably already anticipating this move. He's not stupid. If he's been watching us this long, he knows we're coming for him. Marcus clenched his jaw. The clock was ticking. The more they delayed, the more Davis would move his pieces into place. They had to take action. Let's go, Marcus said, and Rebecca nodded, shifting the car into gear. They drove in silence, the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rumble of the tires the only sounds between them. The city was quiet now, almost unnervingly so, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. Every fiber of his being screamed that they were being watched. Rebecca's grip on the wheel tightened as she turned onto a side road, heading toward a nondescript office building a few blocks from the heart of downtown. It was one of those buildings that blended into the urban sprawl, a place where no one would look twice. Marcus knew the place well. It was one of the FBI's secondary operations hubs, where sensitive data was kept away from prying eyes. It was the perfect location for Davis to stash his hidden files. As they parked a few blocks away, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. "Who is it?" Rebecca asked, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Marcus checked the screen. His stomach dropped. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know what you're planning. You won't make it. If you want to survive, stay away from the building." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He locked eyes with Rebecca. "We've been compromised," he said. Before Rebecca could reply, a loud crash sounded from the alley behind them. The sound of shouts, hurried footsteps, and car engines revving echoed in the night. "They're here," Marcus said, his voice tight. Rebecca's face went pale. "Davis's men. They're onto us." The car doors flew open and Marcus grabbed Rebecca's arm, pulling her out of the vehicle. "We need to move." "Now," he shouted as the sound of approaching cars grew louder. They ran into the shadows, weaving between parked cars and dumpsters. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as they sprinted toward a narrow back entrance into the building. They could hear the engine growling closer. There was no time to waste. Just as they reached the door, Marcus heard a sharp click behind them. A figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. Marcus's pulse quickened. It was Davis. Marcus froze, his body tensing as the familiar figure of Director Davis emerged from the darkness. The harsh streetlight illuminated his face, casting long shadows that made his features appear even more cold and menacing. He was flanked by two of his men, their hands resting on their holstered guns, eyes scanning the alley like hungry predators. Rebecca stopped beside Marcus, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. They were trapped. "Thought you could slip away, Marcus." Davis's voice was smooth, almost mocking, like he'd been expecting them to make this move all along. "You really thought you could expose me and get away with it?" Marcus's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he knew better than to make a move too soon. Davis had been a step ahead of them the whole time. There was no way he'd just let them waltz out of this. "Step aside, Davis," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "You've already lost." We have everything we need to bring you down. The only question is, how long you're going to fight before we take you down." Davis chuckled darkly, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "You think you've got the upper hand? You don't even know how deep this goes, Marcus. You never did." Rebecca's face tightened with frustration, but she didn't say a word. She was smart enough to know that any sudden movements would only escalate things. They needed to outsmart Davis, not provoke him. But the fear was there, clear in her eyes. "I told you to stay away, Rebecca," Davis continued, his eyes flicking to her. "This isn't your fight. It never was. Now look where you are. Do you really think I won't find a way to make sure you disappear along with him?" Marcus felt the anger rising within him. Davis's confidence was infuriating. He had no idea what they had on him, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. Not now. "You're not getting away with this," Marcus said, his voice cold as ice. "This is over, Davis. You can't hide behind your lies any longer. You've already started running scared." Davis's lips curled into a thin smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was a smile of someone who knew something Marcus didn't. "You think this is over?" Davis said, his voice turning ice cold. "I'm just getting started. You're too late." In that moment, Marcus realized that Davis wasn't just talking about the fight he was having with them. No, it was something bigger. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Before he could respond, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. Davis's men immediately snapped into action, turning their heads toward the source of the noise. Marcus and Rebecca seized the moment of distraction. Without hesitation, Marcus pushed Rebecca forward, shoving her toward the building's back entrance. "Run!" he shouted, taking a step forward to block Davis's view. "Go now." Rebecca hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then she bolted, darting through the door just as Marcus spun around to face Davis and his men. He had no choice now but to stand his ground. He couldn't let them catch her. "Go after her." Davis barked at his men. "I'll deal with Marcus." The two agents took off in pursuit, their boots pounding against the concrete as they ran toward the door where Rebecca had vanished. Marcus wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't take on all three of them, especially with the sirens drawing closer. He had only a few seconds before the police arrived. That was the only thing he could count on right now, the fact that Davis couldn't risk drawing attention to himself in the middle of the city. Marcus made his move. He turned and sprinted in the opposite direction, deeper into the alley, heading for a service entrance at the back of the building. His footfalls echoed loudly, but there was no time to care. He could already hear the muffled shout of Davis behind him, his voice laced with anger. "You think you can run from me?" Davis yelled. "You'll never get away with this." Marcus reached the service entrance and yanked the door open just as a bullet whizzed by his head, grazing his ear. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate. His hand was already on the door handle, pushing it wide enough to squeeze through. He pulled it closed behind him, locking it with a quick motion. Inside, the corridor was dark, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and old machinery. Marcus took a few moments to catch his breath, pressing his back against the door as the sound of the pursuit faded. But he knew this wasn't the end. He could still hear Davis's voice, his footsteps pounding toward him. There was no escape. Not yet. Marcus moved swiftly through the narrow hallway, his footsteps silent. He had to find Rebecca. Rebecca was already inside, hidden in one of the maintenance rooms. She'd managed to slip through the building's labyrinth of hallways before Davis's men had even made it inside. She crouched behind a stack of old boxes, her breath shallow and rapid as she listened for the sound of footsteps. She hadn't been able to make contact with Marcus, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off. Every minute felt like an eternity. She needed to get back to the server room, but she couldn't do it alone, not with Davis so close. She pulled out her phone, quickly typing out a message to Marcus. She needed to know where he was, needed to find him before they were both caught. "Marcus, where are you?" She didn't have to wait long before the reply came. It was short and to the point. "In the building. They're coming. Stay hidden." Her heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. Davis had anticipated their every move. He had them exactly where he wanted them. Suddenly, the faint sound of a door opening echoed through the hall. Her heart leaped into her throat. Footsteps, heavy, intentional, slowly drawing nearer. She knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as the footsteps grew louder. Her heart raced in her chest, every beat a drum of impending doom. She could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of her neck, her fingers gripping her phone tightly as if it could somehow protect her. She didn't dare make a sound, not even a breath. Every part of her was frozen in place, as if she could somehow become invisible in the darkness of the maintenance room. The footsteps stopped just outside. Rebecca held her breath, praying that whoever was out there would pass by. But she knew it was futile. They were too close now. Through the crack in the door, she saw a shadow pass, tall, broad, and unmistakable. "Move," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The shadow hovered for a moment longer, then started to move again, its owner, one of Davis's men, stepping toward the maintenance room. The door was only a few inches ajar, and Rebecca could see the faint glint of light reflecting off the man's sunglasses, even though it was well past midnight. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't move. The man was almost at the door now, and Rebecca's hand was shaking as she gripped her phone tighter. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. She had no weapons, no way to defend herself. She was trapped. And then, without warning, the man pushed the door open. Rebecca froze. For a split second, she met the man's eyes, cold, empty, calculating. His hand reached for the gun at his side, and Rebecca's stomach dropped. But before he could make a move, the sound of shouting broke through the tension in the air. "Get down," a voice rang out. "Marcus." In an instant, there was a blur of movement as the man fell to the floor with a grunt. Marcus had tackled him from behind, knocking him to the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. The gun slipped from the man's hand and skidded across the floor. "Move," Marcus shouted, grabbing Rebecca's arm and yanking her up. "We've got seconds before the others show up." Rebecca didn't need any more encouragement. She followed him as they sprinted through the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Marcus was leading, his eyes darting back and forth, scanning for threats. Rebecca was right behind him, her breath coming in rapid gasps, the sound of her heart pounding in her ears. They reached another door, a fire exit Marcus knew. He pushed it open, and they spilled out into a small alley behind the building. For a moment, they were outside free, except for the fact that Davis's men were still hot on their trail. "We need to get to the car," Marcus said, his voice clipped. "Stay low." They didn't hesitate, darting between the shadows of the alleyway, careful to stay hidden from the streetlights. Rebecca's thoughts were racing. They had a brief window of opportunity, but it wouldn't last long. She had to get to the server room. She had to find that last piece of evidence. Davis was still playing the game. But for now, survival was the priority. "Where's the car?" Marcus asked. "Down the block," Rebecca replied, her voice tight. "Keep moving." They turned the corner and headed toward the street. Just as they reached the end of the alley, the screech of tires filled the air. A black SUV came barreling toward them, its headlights blinding in the dark. "Get down," Marcus yelled, pushing Rebecca toward a nearby dumpster. They ducked just as the SUV came to a screeching halt. The door flung open, and two men wearing dark suits stepped out, both carrying weapons. "Stay down," Marcus shouted, pulling Rebecca further behind the dumpster. The men didn't seem to see them at first, and for a moment there was a flicker of hope. But then one of them pointed toward the alley, spotting the fire exit door still ajar. He turned, signaling the others. "They're close. Split up. Don't let them escape." Marcus grabbed Rebecca by the wrist, pulling her back toward the alley. "We can't stay here," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "If they're coming this way, we need to move fast." Rebecca didn't argue. She followed Marcus as they sprinted back down the alley, heading for the next block. The sound of the SUV's engine revving behind them reminded Rebecca just how close they were to being caught. They reached the next street, but the headlights of another vehicle illuminated the intersection. A second car. Shit! Marcus cursed under his breath. They were surrounded. A voice echoed from behind them, low and steady, filled with menace. "You really think you can run, Marcus?" Rebecca's stomach churned. It was Davis. He'd caught up to them faster than she could have imagined. Marcus spun around, his back pressed to Rebecca's as they faced the approaching danger. "We've come this far," he said, his voice hard, but the exhaustion was beginning to show. "We're not stopping now." Davis's figure came into full view as he stepped out of the second car. His face twisted into a cold smile. He had his gun drawn, but he wasn't pointing it at them yet. He wasn't finished with his game. "Do you really think you're going to make it out of this alive, Marcus?" Davis asked. "You're out of your depth. You and Rebecca both." Marcus' eyes locked onto Davis's, unflinching. "I'm not going down without a fight." Davis chuckled darkly. "A fight?" He glanced at his men. "You've got nothing left. You're out of time." Rebecca's pulse raced. Her thoughts were spinning, but one thing was clear. They had no way of escaping this without a plan. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, an emergency tracker she'd been hiding for months. If they couldn't escape by force, then they would have to rely on someone else. She pressed the button and hoped to God it was enough. Marcus glanced over, realizing what she had done. "You didn't." "I did," she said, her voice tight. "The backup team is on the way." The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched. He wasn't sure who she had called, but he knew there was no turning back now. Davis's men would never let them go. Not without a fight. The sound of distant sirens grew louder, echoing through the streets. They were getting closer, but so were Davis's men. And then, without warning, a figure appeared at the end of the alley. A single shot rang out, sharp, clear, and one of Davis's men collapsed to the ground. The gunshot rang through the night, the sharp crack slicing through the tension like a knife. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. His hand went for his gun, his eyes darting to the end of the alley where the shot had come from. The man who had been standing beside Davis crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around him, his body twitching in the final moments of life. The sound of the shot still echoed in the air as the remaining two of Davis's men froze, their eyes widening in disbelief. Davis himself, for the first time, looked caught off guard. His gun lowered slightly, but his expression remained as cold as ever. He turned, his gaze scanning the area, searching for the source of the shot. And for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty. "Stay alert." Davis barked at his men. "We're not alone. This is just another trick." The other two men immediately fanned out, their weapons raised, their eyes darting between the shadows. Rebecca held her breath, her body pressed close to Marcus, as they stayed hidden behind the dumpster. She couldn't see who had fired the shot, but she knew that if their backup had arrived, they had to be close. Maybe the cavalry had come just in time, or maybe they were about to make their final stand. Then from the darkness ahead, another voice broke through. "Davis, you're finished." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Calm, inevitable. The two remaining men whipped around, their weapons now trained on the new figure that had stepped into the alley from the shadows. A tall man in black tactical gear, his face partially obscured by a mask, emerged from the darkness. He was holding an assault rifle, the barrel aimed directly at Davis. Davis's face twisted in rage as he raised his gun once more. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "I'm your worst nightmare," the man replied, his voice laced with cold authority. He didn't flinch as Davis fired, the shot zipping past his head. The masked man's rifle exploded in return, and the second of Davis's men went down with a loud scream, collapsing in a heap on the ground. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Rebecca by the arm and pulled her toward the alley's exit. The sudden chaos had given them the opening they needed. "Move. Now," he shouted. Rebecca didn't hesitate. They ran, pushing through the alley and turning onto the street, just as sirens began to fill the air from every direction. The night was no longer quiet. In fact, it was becoming a war zone. Gunfire, shouts, and the sound of speeding vehicles reverberated throughout the block. They reached the corner where their car was parked. It was only a few hundred feet away, but it felt like miles in the chaos. As they reached it, Marcus quickly yanked open the door, and they both slid inside. "Go, go," Marcus shouted as he slammed the door shut. Rebecca didn't need more prompting. She hit the gas, and the car shot forward, skidding slightly as they pulled onto the road. Marcus glanced back at the scene they had just fled from. The masked man had disappeared into the shadows, and Davis's remaining man was on the ground, motionless. The sirens were closing in fast. "Who was that guy?" Rebecca asked, her voice still shaking from the adrenaline. Marcus shook his head, his eyes narrowed. "I don't know, but it's clear he's not working for Davis. Whoever he is, he's here to take him down too." Rebecca's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but she couldn't see anyone following them, at least not yet. They'd gotten a head start, but she didn't think they were out of danger just yet. Marcus took a deep breath, leaning back into his seat. The sound of his pulse flooded in his ears, and his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the door. "You think we've got enough?" Rebecca asked, glancing at him with a look of determination. Marcus didn't answer immediately. His mind was running a mile a minute, piecing everything together. He was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't let him stop. "It's hard to say. But that shot we heard, whoever's on our side now is playing this game differently. And I think Davis knows that." Rebecca nodded, her grip on the wheel tightening as she made a quick turn onto another street, heading toward a safe house they had mapped out earlier. The road ahead was dark, empty except for the occasional car passing by. The weight of everything that had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The text message from the backup team. The mysterious figure who had taken out Davis's man. The strange feeling that they were still missing something, some piece of the puzzle that didn't add up. They pulled into the safe house's garage, a nondescript building tucked away in an industrial part of the city. Rebecca quickly parked, and the two of them got out. Marcus surveyed their surroundings, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of trouble. "We can rest here for a while," Marcus said, "but we need to keep our guard up. Davis won't stop. He's too far gone to let this slip away from him." Rebecca nodded and pulled a small bag from the back seat. "I've got everything I need to get into the server room. We'll go through the data, see what we've got, and figure out what our next move is." Marcus stared at her, his brow furrowed. "And what if we're wrong? What if everything we've been chasing, everything we've risked, wasn't even the tip of the iceberg?" Rebecca looked back at him, her expression hardening. "We can't stop now. We're too close. We've got the leverage. We just need to push a little harder. Get one step ahead of Davis." Marcus took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He'd been in worse situations before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now, the risks sharper. Davis had everything: connections, power, and influence. They had only a sliver of truth, a faint glimmer of hope. The only thing they could count on now was each other. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance caught their attention. The faint glow of headlights appeared at the end of the street. Someone was coming. "Time's up," Marcus muttered, grabbing Rebecca's arm. They couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The headlights were drawing closer, their glow cutting through the night like a searchlight. Marcus and Rebecca stood still, their backs pressed against the wall of the safe house garage, eyes locked on the street outside. The engine noise grew louder, unmistakable now, the sound of a heavy vehicle, not one that could be mistaken for a civilian car. "Davis?" Rebecca whispered, her voice tense. Marcus didn't answer. His hand hovered over his weapon, but he was already considering his options. The car could be anyone, backup from Davis, or maybe the mysterious figures who had been working with them. Either way, they needed to act fast. "We need to get inside," Marcus muttered. "Stay low, keep quiet. If they see us, we're done." Without waiting for a response, he slipped through the garage door into the shadows, motioning for Rebecca to follow. She moved quickly, her eyes scanning the street ahead for any sign of the approaching car. The tires screeched as the vehicle came to a halt at the entrance to the alley. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as they ducked into a small utility closet just inside the door of the safe house. They didn't have time to lock it or make sure it was secure. They just had to wait. Rebecca pressed her back against the cool concrete wall, her breathing shallow. She could feel the weight of the situation closing in around them. Her mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. The gunshots, the mysterious figures, the betrayal by Davis. They were so close to exposing him, but every step forward seemed to only bring more danger. Then the door to the safe house creaked open. Marcus held his breath, listening intently. There were footsteps, 2 of them, entering cautiously. The faint sound of a voice spoke from just outside. "Clear," a man's voice called out. "No sign of them." Marcus's hand tightened on the edge of the shelf in front of him, his eyes narrowing. It was the voice of the masked man from earlier, the one who had fired the shots and killed Davis's men. They had come to help. Rebecca's shoulders sagged slightly in relief, but she didn't make a sound. They still couldn't afford to take any chances. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw the faint glow of a flashlight sweeping the room. The footsteps drew closer. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. They were close, too close. He needed to make a decision. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building. The door slammed open, and a voice shouted, "They're here." Davis. Marcus knew it wasn't a coincidence. The moment Davis had shown up, the trap had been set. Their backup was too late. They were surrounded. Without thinking, Marcus grabbed Rebecca's hand and yanked her toward the back of the closet, into the small maintenance hallway that led to the back door. It was their only escape route. "Go," he barked. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She followed him, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the pounding in their chests. They had no time to think about what came next, no time to question who was coming for them. All that mattered now was getting out of this building alive. They reached the back door, and Marcus swung it open with a forceful push. The cold air hit them immediately, the streets ahead eerily quiet. They ran, darting around the corner into another alley. But as they did, the unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles filled the air once again. "We're not out yet," Marcus muttered. Rebecca nodded, her breath visible in the chill night air. They could see the lights of Davis's SUV turning the corner, slowly creeping toward them. Davis had brought reinforcements, and it wasn't just him this time. 2 black vans followed closely behind. "We're cornered," Rebecca whispered. Marcus scanned the alley ahead. There was no exit. No way to outrun them now. "Split up," Marcus said quickly. "Head to the docks. There's a boathouse I know." Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. She trusted him. She had to. They split, moving quickly in opposite directions. Marcus headed toward the waterfront, his mind racing. The boathouse was just a few blocks away. If they could make it there, they could hide, regroup, and figure out their next move. But as Marcus reached the end of the alley, a shot rang out. It was close, too close. He ducked behind a dumpster, narrowly avoiding the bullet that whizzed past him. His heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through his body. He had to keep moving. The sound of heavy boots followed him, drawing closer with every step. Davis was on his tail now, and there was no way Marcus could outrun him. Not with Rebecca splitting off and Davis's men in full pursuit. Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The boathouse was only a few hundred feet away. All he had to do was make it there. Suddenly, a voice yelled from behind him. "Stop. We don't have to do this the hard way, Marcus." It was Davis. His voice was cold, detached. Marcus didn't respond. He sprinted faster, his breath coming in heavy bursts as he reached the street that led to the docks. He turned the corner and saw the boathouse ahead. The door was ajar, a faint light shining from inside. It was their only hope. But as he neared the door, the sound of another vehicle screeched to a halt behind him. Marcus spun around, already knowing what was about to happen. Davis stepped out of the SUV, gun drawn. His men flanked him, closing in on Marcus from both sides. "End of the line," Davis said, his tone almost disappointed. "You really thought you could take me down?" Marcus's mind raced. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Without warning, he dropped to the ground, rolling to the side just as Davis fired. The bullet missed by inches. Marcus sprang to his feet, his own gun drawn in a flash. He fired back, the sound of the shots echoing in the night air. But Davis wasn't alone. He had one of his men with a rifle trained on Marcus, ready to fire. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying his hand. If he didn't make this count, it would all be over. He lined up the shot. And then, just as Davis's man took aim, Marcus fired. The shot rang out with precision. The man collapsed, his rifle falling from his hands. Davis didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his cold eyes locked onto Marcus. "You're not walking out of this." Marcus had no choice. He turned and bolted for the door of the boathouse, his feet pounding against the pavement. Behind him, he could hear Davis shouting orders, but Marcus didn't look back. He reached the door, slamming it shut behind him, the sound of footsteps and shouting fading as he ducked into the darkness of the boathouse. For the moment, he was safe. But only for the moment.